Welcome to the Libertarian Institute. My name is Keith Knight. I am managing editor at the Libertarian Institute. We are hosting our 2025 fundraiser. If you'd like to support the work we're doing in our attempt to create a free educational online archive for everything related to economics, history, philosophy, foreign policy, please check out libertarianinstitute.org. You can get an ebook for a $25 donation or a physical copy of any of our books or a number of our books for $50. There's also a list of gifts that you can get, which include a canvas bag or even a signed copy of Scott's latest book, Provoked: 2.5 years of excellent research on the war in Ukraine. I'm joined by Scott Horton, the director at the Libertarian Institute. Scott, what do people need to know about the 2025 fundraiser? Where can they donate? And what are some of the other gifts that they could get?
Well, first they need to know what they're supporting is me and 25 of my best guys and a couple of gals doing hardcore, really good libertarian stuff. And, we have such a great crew. I mean, check out the writers page or the About Us page at the Institute now. I think we need to update it with a couple of more writers, but we've got legends like Jim Bovard and Sheldon Richman and Lori Calhoun and Ted Galen Carpenter. And then we have, of course, you and all the younger generation and quite a few Gen X guys like me in between, like Tom Edlum and Tommy Salmons and others. And we just turn out absolutely great articles. And by we, I mean they turn out great articles. And then, of course, all our podcasts. And we've now published 16 books. Number 17, William Van Wagenen's book on Syria is due to come out anytime now. It's virtually done. He just got back from Syria, or Al-Qaeda-stan, as it's now known, by me. But anyway, he just got back from there, and luckily he didn't get kidnapped this time, so he's all good, and is back and has written a new chapter to add to his book. But he said he's just putting the very last finishing touches on it. So that'll be soon. I know you're working on a couple. Lori Calhoun is working on another one. And we have all kinds of great stuff in the works for this whole year. And so that's what you're supporting is the payroll. We don't have a giant mansion. And we don't have a giant glass office building in Washington or any of this stuff. This is all bang for your buck here. And we also have matching funds. So we've already matched our first donor who promised $10,000 in matching funds. That's been matched now, which is great and extremely helpful. And thank you to everyone who made that possible. And then we have another $15,000 in matching funds from another donor right now. So that means whatever you donate, if you do, then we get double that. And then that goes, again, virtually all to payroll and book production is essentially the entire operating cost of the thing. And then, so that's it. And, by the way, we're just bringing on Jack Hunter, the great Ron Paul Revolution guy from years back and from Rare and all those places. We're bringing him on. We've got Jose Nino is now writing for us. And this guy, Matthew, I'm sorry, I had on the tip of my tongue, ex-left. He's a former intern for, I don't want to say too much, neocons. He knows a lot about the neocons from inside their movement. And Wolfson, that's his name, Matthew Wolfson. He's written quite a few things for us. And of course, we have Brad Pierce, who's one of the most brilliant analysts of American foreign policy going on right now. And of course, Kyle Anzalone, our news editor, and his great shows. He's got the Kyle Anzalone show and Conflicts of Interest, plus all the news articles he writes for us, and also helping run antiwar.com, where he's the opinion editor. And anyway, I can go on and on. All you guys are just great. And of course, the great Keith Knight, jack of all trades, sort of a younger Sheldon Richman here, good on every aspect of libertarian theory and practice and current events and all of that stuff. I know me and Kyle and Connor are pretty myopic on foreign policy issues, but we got a lot more than that. Oh, and I should say specifically, we have the last book that we published is by Joe Mullen, Solus Mullen, and he and Thomas Edlum and Dan Sanchez are all credentialed Austrian school economists who write about that stuff. Three of our fellows. And so, and Richard Booth, of course, the curator of our Oklahoma City bombing archive, which, by the way, announcing I'm going to be interviewing Jesse Trenadu on the show this week for the first interview he's done in a very long time because of his court cases ongoing here. But I'm going to be interviewing Richard Booth and Jesse Trenadu later this week for those who are interested in the truth about the Oklahoma City bombing. We'll be talking about that. And so, and really, I don't know if people don't know this, but it's one of the main reasons. How about that? Like, I don't know. It's a very good reason to support the Institute is we have the ultimate Oklahoma City bombing archive. And me and Richard Booth, mostly him, but some me, I've been collecting those documents for many years. I essentially added my meager archive to his vast one, and it's curated by him. And even if it might sound like a conspiracy theory type topic, and even if there are kooks who have very wrong, and by that I mean neoconservatives in Washington who have very wrong, false narratives about what really happened there and all that, there also is really the truth. And in our archive, it's at libertarianinstitute.org/OKC. It's all good stuff. Government documents and the very best journalism, and none of those kind of false trails that you might find out there. So really proud of that. And a project that I know that you're working on, and I know it's a huge one, is that we have David Hardy's entire archive on Waco, all of his videos and all of his documents. And this is the guy who was the lawyer who helped Mike McNulty get access to the DPS, Texas Rangers, evidence lockers, where he proved that they had pyrotechnic flashbang grenades that were found at all three origins of the fire in that house that had been all mislabeled as silencers. And he wrote the very best book on it, which is called This Is Not an Assault. And he's a former federal cop from the Interior Department. And he's just a wonderful guy. And we have his full archive of Waco materials that we will be putting up at libertarianinstitute.org/Waco, hopefully sometime this year. It's a huge project. I hope people understand, but that's what you're going to support is anti-government extremism, of course, especially on foreign policy. And so matching funds, what can I say, man? Double your donation, write it off on your taxes. And
yes, write it off on your taxes. That's a huge one. Absolutely.
And look, and be good on everything the first time. I mean, it's going around today that Trump's turning on Thomas Massie because Massie's being good and trying to stop them from spending all this money that they don't have. And as everybody knows, he's just like Ron Paul. But what do they say about Ron Paul now? They go, well, Ron Paul was right about everything. Yeah, I know. Some of us were trying to get that through you at the time, and even some of us even before that. But so the lesson is, right, that just listen to the likes of me and my guys, and you'll be right the first time, and you won't have to regret it and go, oh, yeah, I guess that was right after all later.
Exactly. Like in 2016, Trump was saying, Obama's depleted the military. We got to raise military spending. And now Trump's like, I'd like to meet with President Putin and President Xi. We could cut our military budget in half. If you had been at libertarianinstitute.org, you could have been right 8 years before the sitting president. It's just that easy. Check us out at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. I don't know if you heard, but recently we have been told that, look, no more Mr. Nice Guy. We're about to lay down the law, and Douglas Murray is really going to take you people head on. He's aiming it at the MAGA movement, but this is anyone critical of the war in Ukraine. They go, here's the article. Fine. You know what? You want us to address you? Here it is. So you and I are going to go through this article. It is titled, The MAGA Movement is Wrong on Ukraine by Douglas Murray. First 3 paragraphs are irrelevant, but there's still a lot of material here. So I'm going to read this. Let me know what your thoughts are.
Okay.
Douglas Murray says, for a while, the old guard of the Republican Party asserted itself in the Senate and the House. With Trump in exile and fighting 1,000 legal battles, Republican lawmakers such as Lindsey Graham fought to be more pro-Ukraine and anti-Putin than the next man. Some people might think that was cynical, but it was largely an assertion of a Republican principle, which is that, and especially Russian tanks, which is that tanks and especially Russian tanks should not be allowed to roll with impunity into an allied country. But all the while, an upcoming generation of mainly online MAGA Republicans could be seen veering in a different direction. Any response to that paragraph?
Well, I mean, that part's already been answered. If we're going to start history at February 2022, when the tanks finally rolled across, then even as far as that goes, well, they haven't been allowed to do that with impunity. Not at all. America and Europe have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on weapons for Ukraine and American coordinated intelligence and targeting information and all of this stuff to help them fight their war this whole time. So that part's already been solved. If that's what he needed was for total impunity to be denied, it already has been. As they quite oddly, I think, routinely brag and boast, American politicians and writers and pundits, we're killing Russians. It's a proxy war and we're killing Russians. That's what they say. Sending them home in coffins, sending them home in body bags, including targeting their generals. Things like that, helping the Ukrainians target their generals. So what impunity? They already got away with that much. But look, Len, I know where this is going, and everybody listening knows where this is going. He has no plan for how to reverse Russia's gains on the ground and drive them out of the Donbass, Zaporozhye, and Kherson there, Novorossiya. He has no plan to reverse the war. Everybody knows it would take not just European armies, but the U.S. Army and Marines and Navy and Air Force to go in there to reverse Russia's gains on the ground. And we all know that we're not going to do that. And Joe Biden was a hawk, and he said that would be World War III. We're not doing that. And of course, there are CIA and special operations forces on the ground there. And if they got killed in any significant numbers, that could very much be a tripwire for war. It's why they should be withdrawn. I don't know that they're fighting. I think they're probably not, or only in the most clandestine and deniable roles. But I think mostly they're serving as advisors and mostly technical advisors, helping with some of the more complicated equipment and, helping to plan the war and that kind of thing, maybe even down to helping plan certain battles. But I don't think they're really fighting in them. But so Biden wasn't willing to go that far. And I doubt that anywhere in that article, Murray says, yes, it's time to drop the 82nd Airborne in there and reverse Russia's gains and force them all the way back into Russia. So his whole impunity thing is mostly just a red herring, basically, right? He's not willing to say, well, let's see what he's willing to say. Go ahead.
Murray goes on to say, for these people, the question of whether Vladimir Putin was a bad guy was not settled. While the West had turned away from traditional values, not least the Christian faith, here was a leader who spoke in defense of such values. Shortly before Russia's invasion, Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon was podcasting with Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater. Putin ain't woke, said Bannon at one point. He's anti-woke. The Russian people still know which bathroom to use, added Prince. You think there's anything to the fact that, well, Putin is mainly in opposition to what a lot of what we see Democrats say in the West. Therefore, people are much more sympathetic to Putin already, and they might be unable to approach this conflict objectively. Anything to that?
Well, I mean, for all I know, in those quotes, they're just explaining why liberals hate Putin so much is because he reminds them of Republicans, right? I don't even know that they're explicitly praising him, and I don't trust this guy Murray to paraphrase them or quote them correctly. It didn't sound like he was quoting complete sentences by them as much as just parts of some. But even if like some part of MAGA, like Steve Bannon, has said like kind things about Putin's conservatism before, that doesn't mean anything other than, well, I don't know. I guess it could be meaningful in the sense that, it's it's easy for them to say that, oh, it's over the top praise and you just love this dictator so much and blah, blah, blah. It gives them ammunition against the non-interventionist position, possibly. And then it may help to explain why some sentiment on the right is, why are we kicking Russia out of Europe and towards China when China's America's major competitor and they fear adversary? I like to think that's all overblown. I think it is. A lot of it is overblown. But certainly, like, even Henry Kissinger and other practitioners of American grand strategy thought, no, we want to bring Russia closer to us to split them away from China. And in fact, a major part of the thinking behind bogging them down in Eastern Europe is, if we can't coax them to be nice and play by our rules and be part of Europe under our system, then we'll at least bog them down in Eastern Europe and weaken them so that they won't be used to China. So China still is the object. It's Hillary Clinton's Pacific Century we're talking about here, right? That was her article she wrote for Foreign Affairs in 2011 about this whole pivot to Asia to contain China. So the so-called pro-Russian factions, or soft on Russian factions in American foreign policy, and the hawks, they all agree that this is all about making Russia less useful to China in our great power competition with China. And so pick your poison, basically. And then, so yeah, some of the conservatives are saying, well, this guy is essentially a center-right conservative Republican. I'm not saying he's not an autocrat and a strong man. He clearly is, but he's not a self-appointed czar. He could have made himself the czar, I guess. I don't know. He's gonna, when he finally does retire or die in office, he'll leave some form of constitutional system behind that's like a facsimile of a bicameral legislature and an independent judiciary and stuff like that. So it's totally a fair question to wonder why the West would be kicking Russia out of Europe. And then the idea that, oh, he's so right-wing. He's such a right-wing reactionary nationalist that he doesn't want to let men into women's bathrooms, right? That he hasn't, like, this is like the Reason magazine formulation of this question is like, anyone to the right of woke is a right-winger. When, like, actually, no, woke is completely retarded and stupid. And, like, I don't know that I would say it's like the furthest left fringe, but it's only a part of modern progressivism and liberalism and all of that stuff. There are plenty of people on the left half of the spectrum who don't go for that crap at all. How in the world could they? It's completely ridiculous. I don't know. I mean, not to get too far diverted into the culture war, but it's just not true that everyone to the right of woke is a right winger when woke is completely marginal. So that's, I think, maybe some wokeists on the left overestimate their own representation, and then their enemies on the right probably overestimate their representation as well. But I think, and this is what I should have said the first place, it's just not true that there's any significant faction on the American right that supports Russia or is fond of Putin or Russia at all. You look at the opinion polls, right-wingers are harsh or as harsh against Russia as liberals are. And liberals have been completely, conditioned on all this Russiagate and every other thing where they're, and the Ukraine war itself, that they're out of their minds about Russia. But the Republicans are no less hawks on it. Conservatives are no less hawks on it than they've ever been. So you can find, very small factions of people online, but like there's no pro-Russian protests going on. Like even of American, Russian Americans, Russian expats or whatever living in New Jersey or wherever they're living. You don't see big rallies for Putin and celebrating him and taking his side in this thing. There's just nothing like that. Back in the days of communism, there actually were Americans that were loyal to the Soviet Union, which is completely crazy. But here, when Russia is a much more reasonable country in every other way compared to Soviet totalitarianism, nobody takes their side in this. And nobody even, I don't even know there's anything like a Russian-American bun that celebrates them in peacetime either, right? Like nobody's carrying a bucket of water for Vladimir Putin here. Nobody cares about Russia here. It's never really been about that. So I don't know. Maybe you can find some conservative podcasters who said a thing or two, but I don't think that represents the American right in general at all. And hell, I wrote a whole book about this is all Joe Biden's fault. I still don't give a damn about Russia either. So I don't know why all these people who didn't bother writing a book about it are presumed to love Russia more than me or anybody else. They shouldn't be.
It's just amazing to see Republican presidents like Dwight Eisenhower inviting Nikita Khrushchev to America to tour the country for like 10 days in, I want to say, 1954. As if we could talk to the dictator of East Germany to Vladivostok, who's a devout communist dedicated to international socialism. We can talk to. But Putin is just not someone who could be negotiated with. No, I'm sorry. We have a meeting with Mohammed bin Salman later. We don't have time for bad guys like Vladimir Putin.
Right. And Khrushchev was one of the most bloody-handed Stalinists, and his job was killing people in Ukraine. He was the one, when the CIA backed the Nazis in the Cold War, he was the one who actually finished crushing their insurrection. And I believe that he was like second in command during the Holodomor and, before the war. So he is one of the worst Soviet communist totalitarian murderer dictators that you could possibly come up with other than Stalin himself. And that was why he was next after Stalin, was because that was what a horrible guy he was. And so then, more to your point, they said, oh yeah, we got more kinds of washing machines than you commies do. And they were like, damn, you really do, huh?
Well, now I believe it was 1959 that he toured America, 3 years after he earned the name the Butcher of Budapest after his invasion of Hungary. Can't negotiate with anyone who invades a country. Okay. Right. Douglas Murray continues to educate us by saying, you might say that all this was part of the inevitable overcorrection to the period of woke. But these memes gathered force online. At the start of the invasion, the normal conservative view prevailed. Ukraine had been brutally attacked, had stood its ground, and was admirably fighting back.
This is a stupid lie that whatever anti-war sentiment is rooted in this fondness for Putin. Look at how dishonestly he's framing this. Look, everybody, a part of a quote of Steve Bannon saying, well, at least he doesn't let the drag queens read down at the library. And they go, aha, see, that's all you need to know about why anyone would oppose this policy. Give me a break, dude. How could anybody be convinced by such a weak and shallow framing of an argument?
Yep, because he's extremely confident. That I think that's what gives him his credibility. It's unjustifiable. They became additionally.
Today, if I'd be willing to debate Roy Gutman on Syria, and I'm like, man, yes. I mean, he's crazy. He wants to tangle with me on Syria, and I know Roy, and like from years back, he actually was good on Bahrain, but man, he was horrible on Syria and horrible on Serbia too. Back before that, and Bosnia even. He's just walking into a buzzsaw. I don't know what he's thinking. Right now, when Al-Qaeda's taking over Syria and slaughtering civilians in the streets, more than 2,000 of them, I believe, was the number that Joshua Landis cited this morning on Twitter. And Roy Gutman's going to get up there and stick up for the HTS guys? Like, this will be easy. Do I even need to reread my chapter about this stuff before I go up there? I don't know.
I would love to see it.
Yeah. No, that's happening, dude. It's on. It's going to be a riot.
Terrific. So when Murray says they, he is still referring to the MAGA right. He says, they became additionally irritated that unheroic and distinctly unmasculine figures, such as Justin Trudeau of Canada, were suddenly able to present themselves as wartime leaders. When the Zelenskys did things like the Vogue shoot, they were doubtless simply trying to keep their plight, the plight of their country, in the Western public eye. But the online right started to find this stuff risible and smelly. If Biden, Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, and every other hated left-wing globalist was shimmying up to Zelensky, there must be something wrong with him. Do you think anything like that distorts people's view of the war, making them unable to see why Ukraine is virtuous in this fight?
I mean, I don't think that that's what the dissent is about at all. I think whatever, to concede a little to him, like there may be some truth to the idea that, yeah, the more liberals like this guy, the more conservatives don't. Like that, maybe that's built in. But you see what he's doing again is like this bait and switch thing. He's he's just asserting to you that that's what's going on here, right? These are the sentiments that like he's not woke and liberals don't like him. So these are the reasons right wingers support him. You notice he's not quoting any right wingers saying why they oppose the war in Ukraine. He's just
Yeah.
saying, yeah, this is where he like assigns these ridiculous kind of motivations and emotions to right wingers to explain away their anti-war sentiment as making it a pro-Russian thing or a partisan anti-democrat partisan thing. Um, and look, I guess I have trouble looking at Zelensky as such a crook in the scheme of things because it's America that's the crooks. It's Washington that is, he's a sock puppet. He was a sock puppet of this oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, but they're on the outs now. Like, who's he the sock puppet of? He's a sock puppet of Joe Biden in Washington D.C. Sitting there following orders from D.C. and from London, and yeah, he's a crook, but he's exactly as much of a crook as all of them. I mean, it was the State Department rigged game, the Panama Papers, that exposed their own guys. Like, oh, this guy's got a bunch of offshore property holdings and all this stuff. But so in other words, the right wingers aren't wrong about what a crook he is. But I guess my point is there's a lot more wrong with him than that. There's a lot more wrong with the whole policy, right, than this sort of, Hunter Biden level corruption, right? It's this whole overall doctrine of expanding American hegemony into Eastern Europe in a way that has put Ukraine in the middle of these two major powers who are now destroying it, and because they couldn't figure out how to just leave it alone. And I mean, again, particularly the Americans first, and then the Russians are doing exactly what. Look, when people say that Mearsheimer warned in 2015 that Russia was going to wreck Ukraine if America tries to take it away, well, he said that in 2014 on my show. I don't know. I've just been doing this for a long time. We talked about this on my show in 2004 about the Orange Revolution and American intervention there and intervention in Ukraine in the time all the way through here. It's not my fault. I'm old, but that's the job.
It's just so weak when the genuine fears are giving Ukraine a blank check to fight the Russians, knowing that the Americans might have to bail them out, and really have to escalate things. It might require American weapons, as the long-range missiles have already been sent. There could be, this is a nuclear power we're dealing with, all these legitimate things. And Murray is like, yeah, it was things like the Vogue shoot were doubtless simply trying to keep. Oh, yes, the Vogue shoot. It has nothing to do with the fact that on November 15th of 2022, Zelensky came out and said, Poland's been bombed by Russia. NATO needs to respond.
Yeah.
Poland's a NATO country. Yeah, I really don't care about a potential nuclear exchange. You got me, Douglas. I've been lying for 2 years. It's just a Vogue shoot.
Yeah. In fact, I think I have seen one reference to the Vogue thing on Twitter in recent days. And I'm pretty sure the guy said something like, that was when I knew something weird was going on here. Right? He didn't say like, oh, and then I decided I really don't like this guy in a personal way. Right? He was like, that was when I realized like somebody's really kind of trying to force this agenda onto me. You know what I mean? People can sometimes smell the public relations money behind a certain push and just be like, well, wait, why are you trying so hard to control my thinking on this subject? If your case,
or like when
is so
Zelensky
easy to
spoke at the
make.
Oscars. Yeah. Sean Penn introduced Zelensky at the Oscars one year, and I'm like, this seems extremely coordinated. Maybe it's just, that they're all like-minded already, but they all support the lockdowns and they all support Ukraine. I mean, it seems like there's a lot less thought going into this than just, a jury objectively weighing the evidence.
Yep.
Murray says, wittingly or otherwise, the MAGA online right started to absorb Russia's narrative on Ukraine, that it isn't a real country, that the Ukrainians aren't a real people, that if they are a real people, then they are uniquely corrupt. And on it went that Ukrainian soldiers are literal Nazis, that Zelensky is constantly buying villas and yachts in the south of France, that the whole war is one big money laundering operation, that Ukraine's war to push the Russians back is unwinnable because of the great might of the Russian army, and that the whole thing is a giant waste of US taxpayers' money.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, again, it was US AIDS. This is all recently exposed in the Doge stuff. It was USAID that backed the International Organization for Investigative Journalism. I forget exactly what it was called. They were the ones who released the Panama Papers that showed exactly how corrupt Zelensky was, dating back for years before this stage of the war even broke out. And I don't know if he's citing like one or another false report of Zelensky's corruption, but like, yeah, wasn't his wife busted shopping in Switzerland at like the nicest stores? And wasn't there something about some property in England, this kind of thing? But regardless of that, you had William Burns, Biden's head of the CIA, went over there and made Zelensky fire like 10 of his top guys running the war because they were just up to their eyeballs so bad in corruption that Burns told him, I can't stand this, dude. You're not going on like this. All of these guys have to be fired or you're going to be. And so he did. He had to fire the Minister of Defense, at American command because of the level of corruption over there. So that sure is not made up. I mean, there's guys driving around in Lamborghinis and Range Rovers and all the nicest cars right now while Americans are living in their old Honda in the Walmart parking lot. And that's their money in the form of a Lamborghini being driven around by these kooks in downtown Kiev in wartime. Then the whole thing about he throws in there that Ukraine can't win. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's exactly what I said at the beginning of this discussion is he doesn't have the courage, Douglas Murray, to say, who's going to turn this war around for Ukraine? Is it going to be the U.S. Navy and Air Force and 82nd Airborne Division going to go into the Donbass? No. Is he saying a few more ATACMS missiles will make the difference for the Ukrainians? No, that's completely stupid. He can't cite a single expert anywhere saying that. So anyone who's realistic about this knows the question is whether the Russians are going to get Kharkiv and Odessa or whether they're going to be able to call a peace treaty before then. And so everything is all downhill for the Kiev side this whole time. He says, oh, conservatives say that Ukraine's not a real country. Well, I don't remember that. Who said that? That was what Putin said. But which American commentators on this said Ukraine's not a real country at all? I mean, no country's a real country at all. You could argue that these borders are drawn very oddly by the communists, and that helped cause a lot of problems here. Putin was not entirely wrong when he said, well, the east of the country is a gift from Eastern Europe. In other words, Eastern Europe is west of here, which is the same way the Americans used to talk about it. Ukraine is east of Eastern Europe. And it's true that, all the area there in the far west of the country used to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and to Poland. And so, these are Ruthenians. They're very different from the people in the far east of the country who were drawn in there by Lenin for economic purposes because they had industrial capacity there. And he wanted for Ukraine to have their own industrial capacity, but it was also, in a sense, to burden the Ukrainian population with a bunch of Russians so that they would have sway there. Even though they were supposedly creating the new communist man and disregarding all these ethnic differences, it was very deliberate that they moved a bunch of Russians in there, especially later under Stalin, but under Lenin as well. That was why they drew the border where they drew it in the first place. So as I say in the book, is why part of this war is going to be a Pyrrhic victory for Russia, where they're taking virtually all of the population of the country who were sympathetic to them at all out by drawing the line where they've drawn it. Now they're leaving a Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine, that is going to be full of people who hate them and nobody left who really leans toward their point of view anymore. So, or many fewer anyway. So, but which American right-wing commentators did Glenn Beck or whoever whatever, did Mike Cernovich ever say, oh, Ukraine is just made up, so Russia can do what they want with it? No, nobody ever said that. So Douglas Murray's just a liar, tilting at windmills, right? Building straw men and then kicking their asses. Well, give me some more of those lines of crap in that paragraph.
So when it comes to, you addressed all of them except that Ukrainian soldiers are literal Nazis. Now, is this
Only the
claim,
3rd Separate Infantry Division and the 12th Special Forces Unit of the National Guard. Yes.
so is it the fact that they're a very powerful section of the Ukrainian resistance movement, the Ukrainian military? Is that it? Are you saying that there's a high percentage of Nazis, or that, yes, it's small, but they're very influential?
Yeah, the latter there. And it's been like that. They participated in the coup of 2004, but especially since 2014, because then the war broke out. And so the military, much of the military defected to the other side. And that was really the Civil War. The cops and local miners and whoever created these militias and went to fight when they were attacked by Kiev. And so Kiev needed the help of the Nazis. So the guys who had run Right Sector, which was a combination of a few different Nazi groups under the banner of the Right Sector in the Maidan during the Putsch, they then came together as Andriy Beletsky was their leader who put them together. They were called the Azov Battalion, and they went to war. And not only did they fight in Mariupol and drive the Russians out of there, which was their big victory that legitimized them and all of that, but they intervened and prevented peace from breaking out when there were talks in Geneva. They went and murdered some civilians in order to ruin the talks, create a backlash, and all of that. It's all in the book. And, and they're committing war crimes from the beginning and preventing peace from being implemented and repeatedly threatening to murder Poroshenko and then Zelensky if they would dare to make peace, because that would be dishonoring the sacrifice of all the guys who had already died in the war. And so we got to keep going, or he'll hang from a tree on, I don't know how to pronounce it. Starts with a K, the main drag there in Kiev. Or it was Dmitry Urash, I think, who said, we'll just put a bullet in his head. And it was Andrew Kramer of the New York Times who said, hey, man, these are not idle threats. These guys can reach out and touch the president if they need to, if it comes to that. And so it was a real worry. And America wouldn't do anything to help him round up, either of those presidents round up the leaders of these groups. They needed them too bad. And I have all the quotes in the books where Obama administration officials and others are all saying, yeah, they're Nazis, but that's okay. We need them now. And we'll figure out who's a Nazi later and stuff like this. And they're not. Evelyn Farkas is one that comes to mind. There are plenty of those. So
It's like that accepting Al-Qaeda article from Foreign Affairs. It's like,
right.
yeah, look, we might have to embrace what we thought was an enemy, only temporarily. It's like, well, of course, if you're if you're staging some coup, it's not like the average person's like, let me see if I could get a couple weeks off work to stage a coup. It's only these most radical, dedicated people on one side of the aisle or other. Of course, there's not going to be moderate rebels in Syria. Of course, you're not going to have moderate rebels in Ukraine. The people leading this are only going to be, there's a selection process. It's only going to be the most dedicated people of some political side. And in this side, it certainly seems like it is the Banda right faction.
Yeah. And look, it doesn't mean that they dominate the whole government, but they certainly dominated the national security positions in the early government after the putsch. And it's absolutely the case that the Azov Battalion was crucial in the war effort for Kiev for years there, and that now they've been reorganized as the 3rd Separate Infantry Division of the Army and the 12th Special Forces Group of the National Guard. And their leaders are still Nazis. It's still Andriy Beletsky, and I always forget the other guy's name, but I was just tweeting about him the other day. His wife was palling around doing photo ops, and they're talking about, oh, the courageous fighters of the thing. It's like, dude, that lady's the wife of a Hitler-loving Nazi, the leader of the split in the Azov Battalion. He's the leader of the National Guard group. And I got, I need to get one for him, but I have a Google alert for Andriy Beletsky, who's like leading the troops in Kharkiv for months now, and is in the news constantly talking about it. And so, Yeah, and there's going to be problems from that going forward. I mean, there have been neo-Nazis from across Europe and including the Americas as well, who have gone there to fight ever since 2014 to volunteer and be, get battle experience of fighting with the Azov Battalion and fighting as volunteers in the Foreign Legion during this thing. And so, and especially if America, after making all these promises, finishes betraying them and leaving them high and dry, and they have to end the war and lose all that territory anyway, and it was all for nothing, then there's going to be hell to pay for that, But then
And
again,
who
what's
was
Douglas Murray's solution? He doesn't name it. He just says that you're lying if you say that Russia has Ukraine overmatched. But of course they do.
yeah.
And of course, the Abrams A1 battle tank has already been proven obsolete and useless in this fight. You take it out with a $35 drone. And so that's it. What are you going to do? You're going to send in the U.S. Navy? U.S. Navy can't even get to the Azov coast. It's all too shallow. In that area of once you go under the Kerch Bridge there, it's all too shallow in the Sea of Azov there, that little mini gulf to the east of the Crimean Peninsula. And so they can't even fight there anyway. And then if they do, then everybody knows that escalates to nuclear war with the Russian Federation. And we're not going to do that. So what are we doing? As they say, and it was just Adam Kinzinger was saying this last week, I'm pretty sure it was him, was saying that this is such a good bargain for us to do because we're killing Russians and it's not costing our soldiers lives at all. And they just don't even mention the Ukrainians at all. They don't care what happens to Ukraine. Just getting Russians killed, as Daniel McCarthy was saying in his great interview with Tom Woods. You can listen to them talk about it. Just killing Russians is considered an end in itself, a good in itself, which, as he put it, is simply wicked and horrible and wrong. What the hell do they think they're doing? They say that they're strategically weakening Russia. No, they're not. They're giving them cause to militarize. I mean, yes, it's costing them billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of casualties, but they'll be okay. Only now they'll be sitting on a more militarized Russian national government probably from now on. And, Putin's in his 70s. He can't live forever. And what are the chances that the guy that comes after him is a pliable sock puppet like Yeltsin rather than somebody who's worse and further to the right and more anti-American than Putin? Maybe somebody fought in this war comes to power after this. We should not be doing this stuff, man.
Murray goes on. Of course, almost all the allegations of the MAGA right make against Ukraine are infinitely truer of Putin's Russia. Interested in international corruption? Try looking at Putin and his friends. Interested in an anti-Christian government? How about looking at the cynical faith of Putin, who trumpets Christian values while firing rockets at great cathedrals like that in Odessa and
this
recruiting jihadists to fight for him?
Intellectual. I can't believe that this is like published in a grown-up magazine. This is so stupid. Well, I challenge the sincerity of his professed faith because he's in a war right now. Oh yeah, no, Christians don't ever fight. I don't know.
Think Ukraine is cruel in forcing draft dodgers into the army? Consider Putin's army's recruitment process. Dislike Zelensky for not holding an election during a total war? Have you noticed Putin's electoral habits?
Give me a break. Nobody's saying America's supposed to support Russia in the war, right? All of these reasons are things about Ukraine that mean that he's conceding the point. Yeah, you're right. Total corruption, no elections, conscription of the absolutely unwilling. My dad was, on the list, but they didn't call him up for Vietnam, and he did not volunteer to go to Vietnam. But he told me if he had been drafted, he would have gone because that's what you do. And you know what I mean? As you're a citizen of the country, you get conscripted. He would have gone. LBJ and Richard Nixon were not sending around press gangs to kidnap men off the streets and kick their ass and throw them in the back of a van like a movie of a kidnapping. I just saw another clip of this morning. Glenn Greenwald retweeted a thing where the guy is fighting back. He's desperately holding on to the steering wheel of his truck, and he's punching and kicking these guys, doing everything he can to hold them off. And then they succeed in grabbing him. There's too many guys, and they succeed in grabbing him, dragging him out of his own truck and hauling him off to go get blown up on the front line. And it was an absolute horror show of a war over there, by the way. I don't know if you saw this article about the English kid who was 18 and went to go fight in the war. And then his friend that he made over there wrote an article about it and how his very first 10 minutes out, as soon as he went out, the first thing that they were told to do was try to run and bring some ammo to some guys in a ditch on the other side of the field. And on their way over there, they got killed by drones. And the 18-year-old British kid got killed. He's like, he's been running for 40 seconds or something, right? Like he just like jumped out there and ran out there, and blam, they zapped him. Kid's dead.
I remember
Didn't even have
NBC
a chance
saying
to kill anybody before they killed him. What a bummer. And then the guy writing it was like, yeah, and I got my leg blown off. It's like, man, this is a horror show over there, what they're doing.
Yeah, I remember NBC saying something like the life expectancy for a Ukrainian soldier in the Battle of Bakhmut was like 4 hours or something. Just something so psychotic that like what is on the line? Douglas Murray's saying the international order is on the line, freedom versus barbarism is on the line. Do you think, is it literally who rules the Donbass region? Is that really what's up? The Donbass region and NATO expansion? Is that what these kids are dying over?
Yeah, that's what it's about.
Yeah.
Look, this is all a bunch of self-serving crap. The war party always lies, right? So, I mean, you could even just tell how hyperbolic that is. Like, what are we talking about? We're talking about a border dispute in far, far, far Eastern Europe, right? On the Black Sea. When you talk about the Crimean War, right? Like, this is something that, like, Mr. Burns on The Simpsons will talk about, the Crimean War, right? Like, he remembers it. And then, but doesn't it sound like, in whatever people's conception in their mind was from before when people talked about the Crimean War, that's very far east and something between Britain and Russia and Turkey and someone, and just has nothing to do with us. That sounds so long ago and so far away. And now they're trying to tell us that, no, actually, Crimea is absolutely central to America's national interests. Well, just no, it's not. The Russians have ruled the north coast of the Black Sea since America was a country at all. And it's never mattered. Even Robert Kagan himself admits it's never mattered at all to the United States, our national interests. Victoria Nuland's husband, the co-architect of Iraq War II with Bill Kristol, co-founder of PNAC, co-author of Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy, declarer of benevolent global hegemony, says, actually, we don't care about Ukraine. And his wife, Victoria Nuland, says, Russia's a paper tiger. Look at how much trouble they're having even in Eastern Ukraine. Like, they can beat Ukraine, but the idea that they're coming to Poland next, give me a break. And look, when Kagan and Nuland agree with me, you can call it confirmation bias, but I'm right, and they're conceding so this time. That's just the fact of it, dude. So his unstated premise, but his baked in question begging BS premise there is, yeah, if Russia's allowed to break the rules here, the next thing you know, they're going to break all the rules everywhere and no one will ever be able to stop a thing, and whatever is what he's pretending to say there, wants us to infer. But he has no reason in the world that he could demonstrate or describe why we should believe that. This is all about two, obviously, as you said already, two major policies: the ongoing civil war in Eastern Ukraine and America's promise to bring Ukraine into our military alliance with a war guarantee. Both are things where the Russians drew their line. And by the way, Lyle Goldstein, who was at the Naval War College, he told me that he was certain the Russians decided that they were going to war, if necessary, in Ukraine to end the civil war in Ukraine and prevent any further integration into NATO in 2020. And who knows if Donald Trump even knows that this happened, but his government tried to overthrow the government of Belarus again for the third time. The first time was in 2001 and then again in 2005. Then in 2020, the Trump government tried to overthrow the government of Belarus. And that at that time, according to Lyle Goldstein, that was when the Russians said, that's it. And it wasn't just Putin, it was the entire defense establishment in Moscow. And Lyle Goldstein is the type who reads all the defense trades in Russian and in Chinese, and, and more, has, access to classified material as well, or did then. And he said,
Well,
that was the deal. They had decided the Americans are just relentless. We have to draw a line. We have to do something. In other words, they thought of it like they were the ones who had been appeasing us, and now they had to draw the line and stop it. Exactly as the Americans all say, you have to punch the bully in the nose. You can't just keep appeasing the bully. And Putin even said in his declaration of war, just like our side always invokes Munich, he invoked the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and said Stalin tried to appease the fascist aggressor, and we learned the lesson. We lost tens of millions of people in that war, and we have no right to make that same mistake again. You can't appease aggressors. You got to stand up against them. And this is why Stephen Walt from Harvard University, famous kind of co-dean of the Realist School of American Foreign Policy with John Mearsheimer, he said before the war, this is a spiral model thing. People are looking at this like the Munich model where we can't appease the aggressor. But actually what it really is both sides think that they're on the defensive. Both sides cite what they call aggressive actions by the other side. And so we're spiraling and spiraling and spiraling toward a conflict, when actually what you need to do in a situation like this is appease the other side a little bit. And he said, yes, the dreaded A word or something like that. Yes, the dreaded word appease is to ramp this thing down, to prevent an unnecessary war from breaking out. Otherwise, what are you saying? Your pride is more important? Because unless it's really true this guy's Hitler and he's coming for the rest of Europe, then you have no real excuse to not just say, fine, we'll sign a treaty guaranteeing neutrality and we won't bring Ukraine into NATO. We'll tell you we won't bring them into NATO, and hell, we'll go ahead and sign a treaty. They were already telling them. They could have just signed the treaty.
Well, Robert McNamara, he was a data analyst under Curtis LeMay for the Second World War, Secretary of Defense during Vietnam, president of Ford Motor Companies, president of the World Bank, a guy who's really in a position to know what he's talking about. He said in The Fog of War, the number one lesson of history is to empathize with your enemy. He said, we didn't know the Vietnamese well enough to empathize with them. We saw them as Soviet pawns. They saw themselves as fighting in an independence movement in opposition to the Japanese, the French, and the Americans. He said, that's why Vietnam was such a blunder. We didn't understand them. He says, we did understand the Soviet position because we were willing to talk to them in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that saved, I don't know, tens of millions of lives or something. When this guy says the number one lesson of history is to empathize with your enemy, you can look at the documentary, The Fog of War, was turned into a book format. And this is the very first chapter that he goes through, the importance of empathizing with your enemy. That before you want to start exchanging nukes, before you start conscripting people to get their limbs blown off, first empathize and see if there's any attempt to resolve this peacefully. So this is not just some hippie bullcrap. This is people in very high positions of power go, well, obviously, President Trump just said it the other day. He goes, yeah, I don't see how they could have a country like Russia could have NATO right on their border. When Biden came out and said this, who's totally incompetent, when he said Ukraine would join NATO, I said, well, you're going to have a war. And I was right. Now, I don't know if he actually said that at the time, but he did. That is his recollection.
Yeah. I mean, he's pretty hyperbolic a lot of the times, but I basically believe that. It was pretty obvious, I was about to say something clever too, but now I forgot what it was.
Murray's whole.
Oh, I know what it was. It was that McNamara opposed NATO expansion in the 1990s.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of empathizing with your enemy, he was, this, as you say, notorious war hawk, said, well, we shouldn't be doing this. And, General Scowcroft, who had been Bush Sr.'s a four-star general, who had then become Bush Sr.'s national security advisor and had been, I guess, deputy national security advisor under Reagan, or maybe he had been Bush's national security advisor in the vice president's office under Reagan. But anyway, he's the co-author of Bush Sr.'s memoirs and everything. He opposed it. And as I show in the book, Bill Clinton's defense secretaries, Les Aspin and William Perry, both opposed it. And William Perry still blames himself to this day. Or I guess he died recently. No, he's still around. Blames himself for not doing everything possible, including resigning over NATO expansion, because he saw it as such a danger. He said, if you're going to expand NATO, you got to bring the Russians in first. Then it won't matter. The Eastern European countries, all their neutrality will be assured, and we'll all be in one big thing together. That was the most important thing. You might like Warsaw, but Warsaw does not matter to America like Moscow does. The future of mankind hangs in this balance. And so whatever's, on your mind in Budapest is going to have to wait until we get this thing settled first. But they just didn't listen to the likes of him and the likes of Robert McNamara, who, as you said, if Bob McNamara can tell you you shouldn't be doing this, then at the very least, you could just hide behind him. Just go, I don't know, man. The bloody hand of sky in America says that, like, boy, this is over the line. So I'm going to just go with that. Yeah.
I know in Provoked you cite the entirety, I believe, of William Burns's, the then U.S. ambassador to Russia, his "Niet means Niet" memo. The most interesting thing in that, one, he says NATO expansion is going to cause a potential civil war in the East because of disproportionate amount of ethnic Russians. The interesting thing that I found is that he didn't say, the problem is Putin will go to war over this. He said, anyone in Russia who is in politics realizes that this is non-negotiable. So the fact that Murray thinks that this is a Putin issue, from what I've read, this seems to be something that is bipartisan among the Russian elite. That, well, you obviously, the U.S. can't allow missiles in Cuba. No, the Soviets can't have a base in Guatemala where they're sending arms there. That's not allowed. It seems like it's just understood by all the Russian elites that obviously NATO can't go into Ukraine or Georgia. That was fascinating. Did he ever come out publicly and make a declaration like this, or was it just this secret memo to Rice?
Oh, Burns himself? I'm not sure. Putin certainly read everybody the Riot Act at Munich in 2007, which, they hold the Munich Security Conference in Munich every year so that everybody has to be a tough guy, because everybody knows Munich means being a sellout ass. So you can't do that. It's the most obvious thing. But anyway, he read them the Riot Act then. Burns, I don't think, yes, he did talk about this a lot in his book. But I don't think he, well, I don't know. He may have done some interviews on PBS NewsHour or something about it. I don't know. But he did certainly write about it in his book. That, so the Niet means Niet memo comes from, I always forget I think it's from February 2nd of 2008. And so it's just a couple of months before the big meeting in April at Bucharest. And he's warning Condoleezza Rice. He's been talking to Lavrov, but he's been talking to everybody. And just like, by the way, all the way through, the entire Russian defense establishment was absolutely against and paranoid about NATO expansion the entire time. Yeltsin pitched fits about it over and over again. Putin tried very hard to dissuade W. Bush from expansion. Although in 2004, remember, it was like the height of the Iraq War. Nobody in America's foreign policy establishment or media was going to question anything about W. Bush until Katrina drowned New Orleans in August of 2005 you weren't allowed to question anything. So the NATO expansion round in 2004 went through pretty smoothly. No one really willing to bicker about it too much. But they, the whole time, everybody in America knew this was the one reason why not to do this is it's picking an unnecessary fight with Russia. And then you can refine that all the way down to where you even have hawks like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who recommended NATO expansion and potentially even to Ukraine in the 90s, later saying, nah, that would be stupid. We should guarantee neutrality for Ukraine. And you had Kissinger said the same thing. And Ken Pollock, who is a big kind of liberal hawk from the Brookings Institution. He and his partner, Michael O'Hanlon, did a lot to solidify Democratic support for Iraq War II in 2002 and 3, for example. He wrote a monograph in 2018, which see was the height of Russiagate, so no one was listening. But here's a guy, Fiona Hill was the one who introduced Danchenko and Dolan to Christopher Steele and to feed him all the BS for the thing at Brookings. That was where that all came together there. Well, here's a guy from Brookings at the same time puts out or a year later, well, I guess 2 years later at that time, puts out a monograph saying, man, we need a solution to Ukraine. And that solution is, and he built in war guarantees and other things that I don't approve of, but still what we need is neutrality, baked in neutrality for Ukraine, just like we did with Austria and Finland during the last Cold War. No troops and no membership in either treaty organization, and just leave them alone, codify it, shake hands on it, write it down, do a thing. But they wouldn't listen because it was at the height of the Russiagate kookery when I don't remember anybody covering it at all. Maybe somebody did, but
So,
it got very little attention.
I remember Kissinger's position. I want to say it was in like 94, 97. He had the no man's land position where he says, unfortunately, you have Czech Republic, Poland. We don't want these countries in no man's land where there could be a dispute over them. So we want to bring them into NATO, make sure there's American troops there. This way, there's clear red lines.
Right.
In your book, did you say even Kissinger said, well, Ukraine is obviously off the table for this?
Well, later, I'm not sure if he said that at the same time. He was saying, and if the Russians don't like it, tough. Yes, we are moving the dividing line further east. We are bringing more countries under our protection. Yes, from Russia. That's who we're protecting them from. That's what it's all about. So, no, we're not bringing them in. That's completely off the table. And Brzezinski agreed with that. I'm trying to remember exactly what Kissinger said about Ukraine at that time, or if he addressed that in that piece that you're talking about or not. I didn't read all of Kissinger's books of that era to find out. I did read Brzezinski's books, one or two of them anyway. But he did in 2014, after the putsch, but before the loss of Crimea, he wrote a thing for the Washington Post talking about, we need to call time out right now and prevent this thing from getting out of control. And we need to codify neutrality for Ukraine. And he ended up changing that after the war started. But geez, after the war is over, then we're going to have to bring them into NATO. Well, if we're willing to bring them into NATO later to protect them from Russia, then why aren't we willing to invade now and go to war for them now? But he had no answer to that. And of course, I'm not arguing for that. I'm saying that's completely crazy, dude. That means that I got to trade my hometown for theirs and they lose theirs anyway. The whole thing is completely stupid.
Well, Murray's whole issue in here is he's saying, you think Zelensky's bad, Putin is bad. I guess the underlying assumption is that
the
if
fact that
you're
he even
critical,
used the term bad guy at all. Oh, you don't think Putin is a bad guy? You got to learn about who the bad guys are. Like, dude, what are we playing? G.I. Joe toys? We're like 8 years old again right now.
Well, he's acting like the discussion is, all right, we need to send money and weapons to a country. Which one should we send it to, Ukraine or Russia? That's not the discussion. No one's saying we should send money to Russia. If we were saying we need to give Russia a war guarantee and we need to start taking a percentage of your income, we're going to start inflating the dollar that you use that's going to weaken your savings account. We're going to send that to Lavrov and Putin. Well, then, hell yeah, I'd be saying, well, there's corruption problems. Why should I have to fund them? Their elections aren't legit. Well, then I'd say that. But that's not even on the table.
Yeah. No, of course not. Nobody's saying take the Russian side. And look, there are Russian Nazis, but they're all fighting on Ukraine's side. The Russian Nazis hate Vladimir Putin because he's not an ethnic nationalist. He's like 3 clicks to the left of Nazis and routinely condemns them and says they would be the end of the Russian Federation. It's a massive multi-ethnic and multi-religious nation. And no, we're not. This is not like Russia for Ruskies. And he takes guys like that and locks them in the penitentiary. They hate him. They're fighting on Ukraine's side. And they have, before this recent incursion into Kursk by regular Ukrainian forces back last September, the only people who were really crossing the border to fight inside Russia were these Nazi groups, including this guy, Denis Topropskin, or whatever, how you say his name, him and his group, who are Russians, who are fighting for Ukraine to fight against their own country, because they are Nazis, and they're serious Nazis who absolutely just, murder civilians and, beheadings and all of this crazy stuff. Real tough guys. And that's why they're on Ukraine's side fighting, and America's side fighting against Russia right now. Which, the irony of America siding with the communists under Joseph Stalin to fight against Hitler, but now we're willing to ally with Nazis against Republican Russia. And not that the Ukrainian Nazis are Hitler and his Reich or anything, but still, man, you know what I mean? Like, even if you're backing the OUN and UPA against the Soviet communists in your covert action in the 1940s and 50s after the war, well, still, this isn't that. This is red, white, and blue Republican Christian Russia, capitalist Russia. So you might have competing interests with them in some ways, but you can't sell this as the global world totalitarian commie revolution, because it just ain't. So what's to contain, certainly at this expense? And here again is the fundamental dishonesty of Douglas Murray. He has no plan. He has no way that America, or no way to suggest for Ukraine to turn the tide other than for America to intervene outright in the war. We all know that the Germans and the Polish and the French and the British, they're not coming, and they can't win the war for Ukraine either. They would need for America to backstop all of it. That's their words, to backstop all of it, to supply all their logistics and all of their supply trails and all their naval support and all their air support and all their anti-aircraft and all their everything. It's got to be us. If anybody's going to win this war for Ukraine, it would have to be the 82nd Airborne dropped in there, the 3rd Infantry Division, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Marines going in there and breaking things and killing people in huge numbers. And if that were to happen, that would lead to a general war between the Russian Federation and NATO, and then within probably a few days, a general nuclear war. And people should know about nuclear war. And I think Lyle Goldstein doesn't agree with me about this, but every other thing I've ever read, and he knows a hell of a lot about it, but every other thing I've ever read about these war games says that once nukes start going off, that's it. It escalates, because it's use them or lose them. And so nobody's willing to risk the other side nuking their nukes before they have a chance to launch them. So they launch them. And, one American Trident submarine is enough to kill all of Russia. With multiple warheads, you can fit 200 something, I forgot exactly, 250 or 240 something hydrogen bombs. One American sub could kill all of Russia. And we got a hell of a lot more than that. And with, bombers and land-based missiles and multiple submarines. I don't know how many. I think there's 11 nuclear subs or attack subs on station at any given time. I don't know how accurate those numbers are anymore, but that's
all right. Let's finish up.
And that's what Trump said. He keeps saying this. People don't understand the power of nuclear weapons. You just don't understand how devastating they are, or how absolutely catastrophic it would be if they were ever to be used. And usually people in government don't talk like that till after they're retired. William Perry talked like that. Henry Kissinger and George Shultz talked like that, but not until they were gone. They founded this group, Global Zero. But like when someone like Henry Kissinger is saying, hey, listen, you idiots, you need to abolish these machines before you destroy yourselves with them. Something's too dangerous for that guy. This is again with the McNamara thing that at least hear him out. William Perry is not a Democrat wonk. He was not like a politician. Pardon me. He was a wonk, but he was not a Democrat, crook from out in politics, a governor or a senator or something. He was a civilian employee at the Pentagon who rose up through the ranks to become secretary. He's essentially just a analyst, mathematician, and whatever. And so a very nonpartisan guy, definitely not any kind of left-wing progressive, any kind of thing, just a total just civilian Pentagon analyst, militarist. And he wrote a book at the nuclear brink about how we have got to get rid of these machines before they get rid of us, man. It is not safe to keep these things around, especially in these numbers. And I mean, these are, in other words, like, these are the most serious people you can find, dude. You know what I mean? William Perry doesn't crack jokes. William Perry's, this is his entire thing, is understanding just how bad it would be if one of those things hit Dallas, or pick your favorite city, megalopolis, to be destroyed in one or two shots,
Yeah.
So hell yeah. And Trump talks that way. Trump says, and I keep mentioning this. He hasn't mentioned this recently, but he has mentioned it numerous times in the past. And I think it's important. Like, this is where this comes from. Trump had an uncle that taught at MIT, who is the most brilliant and handsome and successful scientist who ever taught at a university, the smartest university of the smartest people anywhere ever. And that uncle taught him all about H-bombs. Donald, sit down. I'm going to tell you all about H-bombs. And impress the hell out of Donald at whatever age that was. He got it. That, like, oh man, this isn't just a thing. We're like, oh, you got to be some Jane Fonda commie hippie to be concerned about this question. No, dude. This is a very patriotic thing to be concerned about. You want to preserve your country. You need a world with fewer of these things in them. And so it's a absolutely smart take. And he keeps bringing it up all the time. You mentioned he wants to slash budgets. He's also talked about slashing the nuclear weapons stockpile. He's worried because China is making more and more now. And he's saying, listen, instead of waiting around for them to catch up to us, let's us and Russia cut our nuke stockpile down to meet China where they're at. How about doing that? Man, no woman Democrat who, would be president would ever do that. Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton would never do that. Even though that's why someone would vote for a Democrat, and particularly a woman, is because they would hope that they would be softer on militarist type issues. But nope, only Nixon can go to China. Any Democrat's got to be muscular and tough. It takes Ronald Reagan to end the Cold War. It takes H.W. Bush to slash nuclear missile stockpiles by 40,000, 30. And so it takes Donald Trump to be able to do something like that. It takes a GOP guy to be able to do something like that. And so there's a call. Don't just support the Institute. Support Donald Trump when he tries to make positive moves on nukes, and let people know how right-wing and conservative and Christian and patriotic you are when you do that. Like, this is not an issue for hippies. This is an issue for experts. People who really know about H-bombs are really, really terrified of them.
Let's give Douglas Murray his final chance to convince us. He ends the article by saying, by this stage, Ukraine is not just a country that the MAGA right has never visited. It is a fantasy country that they imagine they know everything about, and all of it is bad. Perhaps they will manage to wade their way out of the memes, or perhaps they will find out the hard way that most of the American public may dislike woke, but they dislike dictators too, and that it is possible to keep both of these dislikes inside one's head and movement at the same time.
Whatever. That's a funny way of saying the American majority supports the war in Ukraine. Wrong. That's not true at all. Oh, MAGA, you better look out. The American people are going to hold you accountable for doing the thing that your president ran on doing as his highest priority. Give me a break. What was the other stupid point he made in there, other than this is supposed to be some kind of political loser? Oh, yeah, that he knows that conservatives imagine that they know everything about Ukraine and that it's all bad. Now, who does he cite? No one at all. Who's he
Not even a link to click on.
No one exists in the world. This is just this whole thing, this whole article long, he's tilting at windmills. He started off with a partial quote of Steve Bannon that I'm not willing to concede what he claims Bannon even meant by that, because I don't know, and I presume his innocence. But as we already discussed, even granting Murray's interpretation of the quote, so what? Doesn't make a lick of difference. And then the rest of the article is just made up. Who's he tilting at? Randos on Twitter that he remembers seeing one time, said something one time, if that. He doesn't cite anyone for any of these supposed beliefs and favoritism of Russia or imaginings about corruption in Ukraine beyond what has been solidly reported in quality journalism all around the world for years. He's got nothing. The War Party's got nothing. And just like always, just like with Saddam Hussein, they got to threaten you with absolutely insane, hyperbolic consequences if you don't go along. He's going to attack Saddam Hussein's Hitler too. He's going to take over the whole Middle East, and then he's going to nuke you if we don't stop him now. And it's the same thing that they said about him. It's the same thing they say here. Same thing they said about Noriega. Noriega's Hitler, don't you know? Oh, really, huh? And he was a right-wing colonel. Like, they couldn't even pull the commie scam with him. He was our guy, you know? Stop taking orders at some point.
Yeah. I read a book by John J. Mearsheimer titled How States Think, and in it, I was surprised to read, he said, the domino theory is something that we could call completely discredited, saying that the more a country or empire expands, the more it has more assets, but it also has more liabilities. And that's why all these expanding empires continue to fall the more they expand. Is this widely known among, say, the Mearsheimers, the academics, or people at the CFR, that domino theory is not actually accurate? And everything we hear about, if he takes Donbass, he'll take Prague next. Is domino theory?
Yes. I mean, look, it is absolutely the consensus among the liberal centrist foreign policy establishment and everybody else that the domino theory was false in Vietnam. The only country that went communist after Vietnam was Cambodia, and that was because of America carpet bombing the crap out of that place and delegitimizing their own sock puppet kingdom and empowering the Khmer Rouge to come and take over the place. So that was the only domino. America kicked it over with the war to prevent the spread of communism. And so by the time I was a kid, the domino theory had been completely discredited. And people would say, well, that's why they fought the war. They had this stupid theory, and they all just got stuck believing that, no, we have to fight here. We have to hold them here. Even though, like, at some point, speaking of David Hardy, our best author on Waco, he said in government, unlike in the real world, in government, there's truth, there's falsity, and then there's our position. And our position takes place on this whole other level of weird realm, separate from what's true and what's false. And one of the most important things about our position is that it can't be revised, certainly not on any real regular basis. I think a great example of this would be, well, we want to support the moderate rebels in Syria. No, we don't want to support the worst Al-Qaeda guys. But, that's why we need to give more support to the moderates so that they'll be the vanguard of the fight, and that will marginalize the Al-Qaeda guys. But then, no, man, Al-Qaeda is leading the whole battle, and Al-Qaeda takes what they want from the so-called rebels and, or a free Syrian army. A lot of times it's Al-Qaeda that just sends a nicer guy to collect the money and the weapons from the Americans, because that's the game. But they all know that they're playing it. And so, no, this is an Al-Qaeda-led insurgency, and it's going to lead to the Islamic State. But they go, no, our position is we're backing moderate rebels. And somewhere someone is screaming that, listen, I know that you guys agreed that and put it on a piece of paper somewhere, but this needs to be reevaluated. And I don't mean to say that they're innocent. I think a lot of them knew what was going on and what it was all leading to. But you can't expect them to think exactly like their critics either. You know what I mean? That's what happens in a lot of these cases. And I think that's what happens in the case of Ukraine as well, is that, and I'm sorry, because I forgot now the damn point that I was going to get back to about our position here. That reminded me of that. What was the last quote of his?
The last quote of his was, perhaps they will manage to wade their way out of the memes, or perhaps they will find out the hard way that most of the American public may dislike woke, but they dislike dictators too, and that it is possible.
Oh, well,
that wasn't it. But by this stage, Ukraine is not just a country. The MAGA right has never visited. It's a fantasy country they imagine they know everything about, and all of it is bad.
Yeah. I don't remember what I was going to say about our position. I'll have to go back. When I rewind it, I'll be like, oh, I remember now. But anyway, it is the same thing with the war party on all of this stuff. I forgot the parallel I was going to make, but I think anyone critical of Murray, who's not just trying to be reaffirmed because they already agree with him, but anyone who reads that article, I think you might even like change your mind if you agree with him, but you're fair about it. And you read that article, you can see he really has nothing. His argument is, I say your argument is completely hollow and shallow and meaningless, and you just love Putin a lot and love repeating and believing things he says. But that doesn't describe any actual people. And he didn't even attempt to describe anyone's actual anti-war position other than you just don't like Zelensky or whatever. It's completely hollow and stupid, his own argument. So that's what he accuses all of his opponents of, but he completely fails to show why he's right. And again, same with General Clark, and same with any of these hawks on the Piers Morgan show whenever I go on there, or really any of these hawks, same as David Frum and Bill Kristol crying about it on Twitter. They never say, okay, then what's your plan, Stan? Let's hear it, dude. You know what to do? What should we do? Because again, we all already know it would take the U.S. Army to go in there at incredible cost in lives and dollars and the risk of nuclear war to reverse Russia's gains on the ground. So then go ahead, Mr. Murray, with the plan. He doesn't have one. He just has.
You'd think such an intellectual would say, all right, I'm laying out the case. Here are the costs that we should be willing to bear. Here are the benefits we will receive. Here are the potential risks. And here is what's at stake. We must make sure whoever is calling the shots in Donetsk and Luhansk is closer to the European Union than they are to Moscow. That's why hundreds of thousands of deaths need to take place, and we need to, roll the dice on a potential nuclear exchange. It's like, really? I just got to answer to this government, which is illegitimate, versus that one, which is also corrupt and ridiculous. Can't I just move on with my life? I don't love the fact that in Arizona is not an independent state. We are subject to the will of a dementia patient for 4 years, and now a guy who thinks wealth is created by the state confiscating it so long as it crosses borders. Frankly, it's all ridiculous. The question is, what are you going to risk mass death for? They know damn well when it comes to any domestic policy, well, the law is the law, and you can't just resist it, even if the government's violating your freedoms. You have to approach things peacefully because the costs of violence are extremely high, and you don't know what the outcome can be. That's totally reasonable. That's why I don't really support, domestic resistance movements against the federal governments or even your state government. Can't we just talk this out? The vast majority of the issues, I think we can just talk out. But apparently we need blind obedience when our rights are blatantly violated by our domestic government. But when there's a hypothetical threat from 7,000 miles away, get out the nukes. Your sons who wanted to go to college, who want to go to work, no, they're going to get conscripted into the military. Doesn't matter how many of them die. We're going to push Putin back. I think it's extremely difficult. Once you've read Tom Woods.
Well, again, though, they don't even have the courage to say that, though, Keith. I mean, they refuse to say that. They refuse to. Douglas Murray and the rest of them all refuse to finish their statement, and that's why I'm calling for the 82nd Airborne to be deployed. Yes, it's time to conscript American boys to reverse this war. He won't say that. So you're right that's sort of the implication if we're going to do something about this, but it just goes to show the complete bankruptcy of their position. And look, it could be easily stated by anyone. It should go without saying, essentially, right, that it sucks that the Russians have decided to change borders with violent force here. It does set a terrible precedent for Europe and for the rest of the world, doesn't it? That we're going to solve these problems with tanks instead of with negotiations. But then again, or maybe not then again, but just again, America started it. America changed the borders in Yugoslavia. America recognized the independence of Slovenia and Croatia right away, and then Bosnia right after that, and broke off Kosovo from Serbia, which wasn't even a separate so-called constituent republic of Yugoslavia, but was part of Serbia, and intervened in a civil war there. As everybody knows, James Baker invited Saddam Hussein to go ahead and invade Kuwait. That became the big precedent. Doesn't matter that Kuwait's not a member of NATO. We're going to go to war to protect their borders. no matter what. But it was America that told Saddam, go ahead, see if we care. That's what they deserve. And so it just kind of sucks that it's the Americans complaining about all this border changing from their high dungeon when this is all their fault. They're the ones who set all the precedents in the post-Cold War era, and they're the ones who provoked this fight in Ukraine. And so, yeah, it does suck, but it's also tough luck. That's it, you know. And again, it's all downhill from here. So what's the point of prolonging the war? Again, Douglas Murray didn't have the courage to say send in the 82nd Airborne. So without sending in the 82nd Airborne, that means that Ukraine continues to lose more and worse than Russia, who has more men and more material and plenty of money and shells to keep fighting. So
you mentioned in the book that Czechoslovakia, those borders changed, and maybe it's not ideal, or maybe it is. Maybe people should live under different regimes if they have a little more allegiance to another regime. We have a president who is talking about Greenland and Canada changing their borders all the time. I can't imagine it's only going to be a peaceful, acquisition that's done through the homesteading principle. It's probably going to be coercion by a few elites making decisions on behalf of millions of strangers. Maybe not ideal, but the fact that this is the red line that we need to risk life on planet Earth for is so psychotic. And that's why I'm really glad that people like you are getting on Piers Morgan's show to reach the audience that Douglas Murray's been reaching for far too long.
yeah. Well, and there's secession movements like this all over the world. I mean, I hope they don't all get opposed with violent force, but there's always been, or for a very long time, there's been the dispute between the Belgians and the Flemish over who's collecting and producing the most tax revenue, consuming it and all of that. There's the Catalonians and the Basque separatists in Spain. You've got the Scottish who want to leave, some of them at least, who want to leave the United Kingdom. And I'm sure there's a million more. There are places where, like, right eastern Washington State wants to split off and join Idaho. Or was that Oregon? Yeah. You got parts of Northern California that wants to break off and call themselves Jefferson to go with Washington over there. And whatever, all those things should be negotiable. In America, it's not ancient ethnic divisions, but it's just a question of who's producing what and consuming what from the different regions, basically, that people fight about. But over there are plenty of cases throughout the old world where people might want to renegotiate borders. And so it is dangerous to have the Russians come rolling in there. But that's why the people of Delaware should have never elected Joe Biden in the first place to the U.S. Senate. I mean, that's seriously, he's been a huge engine behind this entire ridiculous expansionist policy this whole time and got the world into this crisis. People like Perry were right. Just makes perfect sense. No, Ron Paul was right. We should abandon NATO and just come home, and that's it. But I'm saying, all other things being equal, and you're talking about creating a new security system for Europe and America staying, when we should have brought Russia inside, and they're never willing to do that. And so, and if they had done that, it would have nullified the threat of Russia that they would need to protect any of those other Eastern European countries from Russia about. So it would be fine. It would take care of itself. It's like, who needs missile defenses if you get rid of all the missiles? You know what I mean? You just take care of the problem, and then you don't need the Band-Aid for the problem. So it could have been done a long time ago.
For those interested in such analyses like this, please check out libertarianinstitute.org. Like I said, hey, $50 will get you not just money you could write off on your taxes, but can get you a physical copy of a book. You can get an ebook or even a signed copy of Scott's book, Provoked. Thanks to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute. Scott Horton, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Keith.